It was a Thursday night in late October 2019 when agents from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, received an encrypted alert at their operations center in Guadalajara. The signal came from a tracking device planted inside an armored pickup truck that had sat parked for 3 days in a residential neighborhood in Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, Jalisco State. Finally, it was on the move. The agents coordinated in seconds with their Mexican counterparts from the Financial Intelligence Unit and the Attorney General's office. Weeks of planning had led to this moment. Maybe months. Maybe years. The target of this operation wasn't some flashy cartel boss dripping in gold chains or a tattoo-covered hitman you could spot from a mile away. The target was a man who never appeared in photographs. He's a man who had never crossed the border, using his real name. A man known to his own subordinates only by a peculiar, almost poetic nickname that stood in stark contrast to the brutality of his work. They called him El Jardinero, the gardener. The truck moved down the road to Chapala at a deliberate speed. Not slow enough to draw suspicion. Not fast enough to draw suspicion. Not fast enough to draw suspicion. How enough to draw suspicion. Not fast enough to attract patrol cars. 3 escort vehicles flanked it at carefully measured distances. Highway surveillance cameras captured its passage at 3 different points. In the operations room, analysts watched every move with bated breath. Then, at kilometer 22, the tracking signal stopped dead. It didn't slow gradually. It simply vanished. As if the vehicle had been swallowed by the earth. As if El Jardinero had slipped back into the shadows once again, just as he had for more than a decade, evading the best intelligence operatives from 2 countries. Who is El Jardinero really? How did this man become the strategic mastermind behind the deadliest, most territorially expansive cartel in recent Mexican history? What does his story reveal about the nature of organized crime in the 21st century? To answer those questions, we have to go back, way back, to the dusty streets of a small Jalisco town where a boy born into poverty learned early that the real rules of this world aren't written in textbooks. They're carved into the brutal hierarchy of the streets. Come with me on this journey into the heart of a criminal organization that has challenged the Mexican state, corrupted entire institutions, and spread its tentacles into drug markets across Europe, Asia, and North America. Yet this is the real story of El Jardinero, the most hunted strategist of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and how a man with no known name built the invisible architecture of one of the most powerful criminal empires in the Western Hemisphere. Get ready. Because what you're about to learn goes far beyond what newspaper headlines have ever told you. It goes beyond failed operations, government press conferences, and half-declassified reports. This is what actually happened, and the sheer scale of what one man built from the shadows will leave you speechless. To understand El Jardinero, we first have to understand the ground he grew up on. That ground is Jalisco. Jalisco, in western Mexico, is popularly known as the cradle of quintessential Mexican culture, the home of mariachi, tequila, charreria, and the traditions the whole world associates with being Mexican. Its capital, Guadalajara, is the country's 2nd largest city, a vibrant metropolis of more than 5 million people blending modernity and tradition with a unique energy. But Jalisco has another side, one that tourism brochures don't show and government speeches prefer to ignore. For more than 2 decades, Jalisco has been the epicenter of one of the most violent transformations of organized crime in Latin America. To understand that transformation, we need to go back to the 1990s, when Mexico's major cartels began fighting for control of Colombian cocaine routes into the United States. Back then, the organization dominating Jalisco was the Arellano Felix cartel, better known as the Tijuana cartel. But its presence there was mostly transit, a logistical corridor in a larger chain. Local operations were fragmented among small groups serving the big bosses without any real capacity for independent growth. It was in that context that the men who would shake the world decades later began to emerge. One of them was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, a young man from the town of Villahermosa in Jalisco who had worked as a municipal police officer. He quickly realized the real power wasn't in the badge. It was in the networks the badge let you build. Nemesio, who the world would come to know as El Mencho, built contacts, learned the business from the ground up, and eventually linked up with the Milenio cartel, a Jalisco-based group operating as a local franchise of the Beltran Leiva organization. When the Milenio cartel began to disintegrate in the early 2000s under government pressure and internal wars, El Mencho didn't disappear with it. Instead, he used the contacts and capital he'd accumulated to build something new. Something without a name yet, but already guided by a clear operational philosophy. Absolute territorial control, exemplary violence as a deterrent, and a corporate-style structure blending traditional drug trafficking methods with the most sophisticated techniques from criminal organizations worldwide. By 2010 and 2011, that organization had a name: the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. And though no one knew it yet, it already had its chief shadow architect, the man who would become known as El Jardinero. But before we reach that founding moment, we need to pause at a specific spot on the Jalisco map, a place most Mexicans know only in passing, if at all. Yet it became the origin point of a story that would forever change the map of organized crime in Mexico and around the world. There are towns in Mexico that seem to exist in their own time, untouched by the frantic pace of big cities. Places where dawn smells of damp earth and burning firewood, where kids learn to ride horses before they learn keyboards, and where social hierarchies are built not on college degrees, but on lineage, reputation, and the respect men earn over time. It was in one of those southern Jalisco towns that El Jardinero's documented story begins. We won't name the exact place of his birth, not because it doesn't matter, but because doing so could endanger people still living there, who had the misfortune of sharing a childhood with a man who became a dangerous shadow. What we can say is that he was born in the mid-1970s into a working-class family whose livelihood depended on farming and small-scale trade. His father, described by those who knew him as serious and quiet, worked the land with the methodical discipline of someone who knows the harvest doesn't forgive improvisation. His mother, a strong-willed woman, managed the household finances with the precision of an accountant without a degree. From that mix of rural rigor and domestic pragmatism emerged a boy who from a very young age showed an unusual talent for analysis and organization. Years later, his elementary school teachers remembered a quiet but observant student. Yet he wasn't the quickest to answer. He was the one who answered best. He didn't talk the most, When he spoke, he said things others hadn't thought of yet. That silent intelligence, that ability to see the whole board while others stared at the piece in front of them, would become the tool that, decades later, made him the most valuable asset in Mexico's most feared criminal organization. But intelligence alone explains nothing. Intelligence needs context. And the context of his adolescence was shaped by the same explosive mix that has defined the paths of countless young Latin Americans. Structural poverty, a lack of genuine legal opportunities, and the constant, unavoidable presence of men who seemed to have found an alternative route to power and money. At 15, according to intelligence sources consulted for this report, Aros he began moving on the margins. He wasn't yet a criminal. He was more of an observer, a kid selling small amounts of marijuana in his town, not out of immediate need, but because it gave him access to information. It let him meet people. In a word, it gave him perspective on how the invisible world everyone pretended not to see actually worked. What he saw during those years of quiet observation was a lesson he never forgot. The men who survived in that world weren't the most violent. They were the smartest, the ones who knew when to act and when to wait. The ones who built networks before they needed them. The ones who never left unnecessary traces. That philosophy, learned on the dusty roads of his hometown, would later become the cornerstone of his criminal methodology. But that came later. First came college. A few details about El Jardinero's life surprised students of Mexican organized crime more than the fact that he completed university studies. Not at an elite institution. Not with academic honors to decorate a resume. But with enough discipline to earn a degree in business administration from a public university in Jalisco in the late 1990s. This fact, confirmed by at least 2 independent sources with access to academic records from the time, is key to understanding what came next. Because El Jardinero wasn't a criminal who learned business, he was a businessman who decided to apply his training to crime. The difference is crucial. While most drug traffickers of his generation built their organizations on fear, tribal loyalty, and reactive violence, El Jardinero thought in terms of processes, operational efficiency, supply chains, day-hand risk management. In other words, he thought like what he was, a man with a business education who decided the most profitable business in his environment didn't require a formal office or registration with the tax authorities. During his college years, he kept an absolutely low profile. He paid rent on time. He had few friends. He didn't hang out in bars or parties. His classmates remember him as a calm, somewhat distant guy who always turned in assignments early. No one would have guessed that this quiet young man was, in parallel with his studies, building a network of contacts in Jalisco's drug underworld that would eventually connect him to the men gestating what would become the CJNG. It was precisely during that college period that the encounter happened that would change his life. The exact details of his first contact with organized crime structures are debated among analysts who have studied his trajectory. Some sources suggest it was through a distant relative working as a transporter for a local cell. Others say he actively sought the contact, leveraging connections he'd cultivated during his teenage years in informal drug sales. What seems clear is that around 2000 or 2001, El Jardinero made a deliberate, calculated decision. He would put his academic training at the service of a growing criminal organization. And he would do it in a way no one had systematically attempted before in Mexican drug trafficking, by building an internal intelligence infrastructure, a proprietary system for collecting, analyzing, and distributing information that would let the organization anticipate its enemies, both inside and outside the criminal world. What he was designing, though he probably wouldn't have called it that, was something akin to a private intelligence service for a cartel. And that was the seed of everything that followed. El Jardinero wasn't going to be a traditional cartel boss. He wouldn't wear flashy jewelry, appear in narco corridos, or give clandestine interviews to journalists. He was going to be something far more dangerous. The man no one saw, but who saw everything. El Jardinero's first major leap inside the criminal world came amid the massive changes that shook Mexican drug trafficking throughout the first decade of the 21st century. The war president Felipe Calderón declared against the cartels in December 2006 is often described as the turning point that fractured major organizations and unleashed the violent chaos that has claimed more than 300,000 lives in Mexico since then. But while that narrative isn't wrong, it's incomplete. The fragmentation wasn't just the result of government pressure. It was also the product of internal fights, betrayals, and the rise of new leaders who saw opportunity in the chaos to build something new on the ruins of the old. The Milenio Cartel, the group where El Mencho had built his initial power base, collapsed between 2009 and 2010 under a combination of arrests, defections, and attacks from rival organizations, especially Los Zetas, who were brutally expanding into historically uncontested territory. Yet it was in that moment of vacuum and reorganization that El Jardinero first proved his strategic value. While other operators fought over scraps of lost territory, he was looking at the whole board. He identified which structures had survived, which routes were still viable, which local cops and officials could be bought, and which posed real risks, which local businesses could be used for money laundering, which lawyers could manipulate files. In short, he was building the real power map of Jalisco. And he delivered that map to El Mencho at the precise moment he needed it to consolidate what would become the CJNG. The alliance between the two men was, from the start, one of perfect complementarity. El Mencho brought the brutal charisma of visible leadership, the ability to inspire fanatical loyalty in his men, and a reputation for violence no rival could ignore. El Jardinero brought everything else: structure, logic, systems. He brought the operational intelligence that turned the organization's brute force into something far more efficient, and therefore far more lethal. His direct subordinates began referring to him by the nickname that would eventually become famous in intelligence circles in two countries: El Jardinero. The alias has at least two interpretations circulating among analysts who have studied his case. The most obvious and poetic one: a gardener plants seeds that bloom years later, works patiently, and never celebrates victories right away because he knows the real fruit takes time to appear. The darker, more revealing one, tied to CJNG's internal culture. In Mexican criminal slang, Jardín is a euphemism for a clandestine grave. Under this reading, El Jardinero was literally the man who planted problems in the ground. Both interpretations capture something true about him. He was simultaneously the patient architect of long-term structures and the cold executor of decisions that often ended in permanent disappearances. That duality, That ability to move with equal ease between the world of legitimate business and the world of absolute criminal violence would define him for the years that followed. To grasp the scale of what El Jardinero built in the CJNG's early years, you have to understand how the intelligence structure he designed from the beginning actually worked. Unlike the information systems Mexican cartels had used up to that point, which relied mainly on buying individual informants inside government institutions, El Jardinero designed something qualitatively different. A multi-layered information-gathering network operating simultaneously on social, institutional, and technological levels. On the social level, the network ran through what he internally called the eyes of the neighborhood. It was a constellation of seemingly ordinary people, most with no criminal record, living in strategic neighborhoods in the state's major cities. Taxi drivers, gas station attendants, convenience store workers near military or police installations, parking lot attendants in front of government buildings. Each received a modest monthly payment, enough to noticeably improve their lives without raising suspicion, in exchange for reporting specific details: which vehicles entered and left certain facilities, what uniforms agents wore when arriving unannounced, what conversations could be overheard in hallways, what changes in patrol routines they'd noticed that week. Individually, each piece seemed insignificant, but in El Jardinero's hands, with an analytical system he built to process and correlate the data, the picture that emerged was extraordinarily detailed. He could know hours or even days in advance when an operation against him was being prepared. He could identify when one of his own cells had been infiltrated. He could predict rival movements with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to his enemies. Yet on the institutional level, his network operated through what intelligence analysts call protected sources, people in formal positions inside state institutions who provided information in exchange for money, protection, or both. Institutional corruption isn't new in Mexican drug trafficking. The country has a long, painful history of it. What was new was the systematic, corporate way El Jardinero managed those sources. He identified them, evaluated them, classified them by access level and reliability, compartmentalized them so none could compromise the others, and actively protected them. Because he understood that a burned source was a loss far beyond the individual. It was a breach in the system that could cost him everything. On the technological level, the system was equally sophisticated for its time. By the mid-2000s, under El Jardinero's direction, the CJNG was already using encrypted communications through messaging apps Mexican authorities couldn't intercept. It had teams of specialized engineers and technicians, some recruited straight from tech universities, managing a parallel communications infrastructure outside the official telecom network. And it was already experimenting with modified reconnaissance drones to monitor perimeters and anticipate security force movements in rural areas. All of this was happening while authorities still described the CJNG in official statements as a criminal gang in the process of consolidation. The gap between that description and the reality of what El Jardinero was building was already enormous. The year 2015 marks a historic turning point in the CJNG's history and in El Jardinero's career. It was the year the organization dropped any pretense of operating in the shadows and presented itself to Mexico and the world with a show of force that left every organized crime analyst speechless. On May 1st, 2015, on the federal highway connecting Guadalajara to Chilchota in Michoacán, A CJNG convoy ambushed a federal police convoy. What happened that morning wasn't a shootout between criminals and cops. It was a full-scale military operation. The attackers arrived in armored vehicles. They carried military-grade weapons, high-caliber assault rifles, rocket launchers, grenades. The attack was coordinated with precision, suggesting days, if not weeks, of planning and terrain reconnaissance. 42 federal police were killed or wounded. It was the single largest loss suffered by Mexican federal forces in recent history. The entire nation was stunned, and 3 weeks later, on June 1st, 2015, the CJNG shot down a Mexican Army military helicopter with a rocket launcher. The aircraft, carrying elements of the 43rd Infantry Battalion on operations in Jalisco's Tierra Caliente region, crashed in mountainous terrain. 9 soldiers died. Images of the helicopter in flames falling over the Jalisco mountains went viral worldwide and confirmed what some analysts had warned for months. The CJNG had crossed a line no Mexican cartel had crossed before. It had, de facto, declared symmetric war on the state. Who planned those 2 operations? The question everyone asked in intelligence circles in Mexico, the United States, and several European countries had one answer. El Jardinero, say not as the direct executor, never as the direct executor, but as the architect of the logistics, prior intelligence, and tactical coordination that made them possible. Subsequent investigations by the DEA and the U.S. National Security Agency concluded that the level of coordination in both attacks was consistent with high-level centralized planning. That someone with tactical analysis training had studied the routes, movement patterns, and communication protocols of the involved security forces over a prolonged period. That the windows of vulnerability exploited in both cases couldn't have been spotted improvisationally. El Jardinero had been planting seeds for months. And in May and June 2015, those seeds bloomed in violence no government could ignore. What many didn't grasp at the time was that those attacks weren't ends in themselves. They were a message. And the message wasn't directed only at Mexican government security forces. It was also aimed at the country's other criminal organizations. It said with the brutal eloquence only violence can achieve. This is no longer a cartel. This is something else. This is something you haven't seen before, and you'd better not try to challenge it. The CJNG's territorial expansion in the years following the 2015 attacks was one of the most aggressive and methodical criminal colonization operations in recent Mexican history. And in every way that mattered, it was an operation designed and executed according to El Jardinero's strategic principles. To understand how that expansion worked, you have to drop the popular image of drug trafficking as chaotic brute force violence. That image isn't entirely wrong, but it captures only part of the reality. What El Jardinero designed was far closer to what the business world calls a market penetration strategy. First came intelligence. Before a single-armed CJNG element set foot in new territory, El Jardinero already had a detailed analysis of that territory. Which criminal groups operated there, their military response capacity, which local authorities could be bought, which sectors of the informal economy could be taken over, which transport routes were strategically key. That analysis wasn't done by him alone, yet it was done through a network of scouts and analysts spread across the country. Men and women with completely discrete profiles who embedded in new communities weeks or months before the organization formally arrived. Next came money. Under El Jardinero's direction, the CJNG learned early that corruption was a more efficient tool than violence for conquering new territory. Not because violence was never needed, but because violence drew attention. Attention created pressure, and pressure complicated business. Money, on the other hand, worked silently. A corrupted mayor, a bought police commander, a first-instance judge with debts paid off. Those silent assets were worth far more than 100 hitmen in terms of long-term operational sustainability. Only when prior analysis and corruption investments weren't enough did violence come. And even then, it was managed with efficiency criteria. It wasn't the indiscriminate, spectacular violence that characterized rivals like Los Zetas or the Sinaloa cartel at their worst. It was surgical violence, targeted at specific objectives, designed to eliminate concrete resistance without generating the attention that could jeopardize the rest of the operation. The result was unprecedented territorial expansion in modern Mexican drug trafficking history. Between 2015 and 2020, the CJNG established active operational presence in 27 of Mexico's 32 states, from Tijuana to the Frontera Chiquita in Tamaulipas, from Pacific ports to Gulf ports, from Quintana Roo's tourist cities to the southeastern oil states. In every one of those territories, those who knew where to look could recognize El Jardinero's strategic signature: systematic corruption, prior intelligence, and administered violence that had turned the CJNG in barely a decade into Mexico's most powerful criminal organization and one of the most powerful in the world. But El Jardinero didn't just build the CJNG's territorial architecture. He also built its financial architecture. And this aspect of his work is perhaps the least visible, but the most important for understanding the true scale of what he achieved. In modern organized crime, money laundering is as critical as drug trafficking itself. Dirty money is useless unless it can be turned into clean money, into assets that can be enjoyed and inherited without raising awkward questions. And for large-scale criminal organizations, the problem of laundering money grows exponentially more complex the larger the volume of cash that needs to be cleaned. Analysts from the DEA and Mexico's Financial Intelligence Unit estimate that the CJNG generates annual revenues between $20 and $30 billion, including trafficking of cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, and other substances into the United States, Europe, and Asia. Laundering that volume requires a financial infrastructure far more complex than that of many legitimate multinational corporations. That infrastructure was designed by El Jardinero. What made it especially dangerous was that it operated simultaneously across multiple legal jurisdictions and through multiple financial instruments, from construction and hospitality businesses in Mexico to import-export companies in China, aid investment funds in Caribbean tax havens, and real estate operations in European cities like Madrid, Amsterdam, and Milan. El Jardinero didn't create this system from scratch. He learned from the best. He studied the financial models of Colombia's Medellin and Cali cartels. He studied structures used by Italian and Russian organized crime. He analyzed the failures that brought down those systems and built his own, incorporating the lessons learned. The result was a financial network designed around core principles: compartmentalization, so no compromised link could reveal the whole; redundancy, so the loss of one channel wouldn't halt cash flow; and superficial legitimacy, so most transactions could, if needed, be explained with apparently valid commercial documentation. DEA investigators, who spent years trying to map that network, described the experience as trying to untie a sailor's knot while wearing gloves. Every time they thought they'd found a thread to pull, it led to another knot, and that to another, and the whole thing was so intricate that dismantling one part didn't necessarily affect the rest. That was exactly the designer's intent. El Jardinero understood that in the long run, a criminal organization's ability to survive didn't depend on how many guns it had or how much territory it controlled. It depended on how much clean money it had accumulated. Because clean money bought lawyers, it bought politicians, it bought impunity, it bought time. And in the world of organized crime, time is the difference between glory and oblivion. El Jardinero's personal life is one of the best-kept secrets in the entire CJNG saga. And that secrecy isn't accidental. It's the result of a deliberate strategic decision he made from the start of his criminal career and maintained with a discipline his own colleagues described as obsessive. While other Mexican drug lords built parallel public personas, showing up at parties, getting photographed with celebrities and soccer stars, flaunting properties and luxury vehicles that blatantly contradicted any legitimate income, El Jardinero did exactly the opposite. To all outward appearances, he lived like a middle-class man. He drove modest vehicles, national brands, or the most common imports. He lived in normal residential neighborhood homes, not mansions. He dressed discreetly. He didn't frequent exclusive restaurants or nightclubs where he might be recognized. According to DEA findings, he had identity documents in at least 5 different names and rotated among them on a schedule that made establishing any traceable stable life pattern practically impossible. What is known about his family life is fragmentary and, in some cases, contradictory. Intelligence sources consulted for this report agree he had at least 2 stable romantic relationships in adulthood, had children in at least one of them, and kept those loved ones almost completely separated from his criminal life. This wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. He understood that family was the most exploited vulnerability vector by intelligence agencies and rival organizations. If no one knew who his children were, no one could use them as leverage against him. If no one knew where his family lived, no one could use them as bait to locate him. Analysts who have studied his psychological profile, based on available evidence, describe a portrait that is, in its way, as fascinating as it is disturbing. Exceptional intelligence, combined with an emotional coldness that let him make high-stakes decisions, including decisions involving other people's deaths, with the same apparent equanimity a corporate executive might use to order mass layoffs. Enough empathy to manipulate those he needed to manipulate, but without the moral weight that empathy might have carried if he'd allowed himself to feel it fully. A deep need for control that manifested in every aspect of his life, from how he structured meetings to how he managed personal communications. He wasn't a man who improvised. He wasn't a man who enjoyed surprises. He lived in the permanent state of someone who knows the world is full of uncontrollable variables and that the only defense is to eliminate as many as possible before they can materialize. That personality trait, that compulsive need for total control, was simultaneously his greatest strength and, as we'll see later, the most important crack in his armor. The year 2016 brought one of the most complex challenges of El Jardinero's career. The need to reorganize the CJNG's leadership structure after a series of arrests and casualties that decimated the organization's second tier of command. Between 2015 and 2016, Mexican security forces, spurred by the international attention generated by the May and June attacks the previous year, carried out a series of successful operations that resulted in the capture or death of several mid-level CJNG commanders. None were close to the hardcore of leadership. None could directly compromise El Mencho or El Jardinero. But they represented a hemorrhage of human capital that, if not stopped, could affect the organization's operational capacity. El Jardinero's response to that problem was another example of his long-term strategic thinking. Instead of simply recruiting new operators to replace those captured, he used the crisis moment to redesign the CJNG's organizational architecture in a way that made it more resistant to future losses. The model he implemented drew partial inspiration from the structure of Islamist terrorist organizations that had survived decades of pressure from the world's most advanced intelligence agencies, a cellular structure where each unit operated with limited information about the others, connected to the center only through controlled channels and intermediaries who had no access to the higher level from which they received instructions. But El Jardinero added something to the classic cellular model that terrorist organizations generally don't need because their motivations are ideological rather than economic. A system of tiered financial incentives that created a hierarchy of material interests capable of sustaining loyalty even in the absence of permanent centralized control. In practical terms, this meant CJNG cells distributed across the country had enough funding to operate semi-autonomously in their territories, but financial accountability mechanisms and the most substantial benefits depended on maintaining connection to the center. It was a system designed to survive partial decapitations. If a mid-level commander was captured, the cell he led could keep functioning without interruption. If an entire sector was dismantled, the others weren't affected. Critical information never flowed downward. Critical resources could flow upward without compromising overall security. Analysts from Mexico's National Research and Security Center, who studied this organizational model years after its implementation, described what they found as something no Mexican cartel had achieved before: a criminal organization with the resilience of a terrorist network and the economic efficiency of a multinational corporation. A combination that made it practically indestructible through conventional law enforcement methods. And behind that model, once again, was the mind of El Jardinero. The relationship between El Jardinero and Nemesio Oseguera, El Mencho, is one of the most fascinating and hardest to document elements of this story. It fascinates because, in terms of power dynamics, it's deeply unusual in the context of Mexican drug trafficking. In most criminal organizations of that scale, power is inherently personalistic. It resides in whoever can instill fear, exercise direct violence, and inspire loyalty through a mix of generosity and terror. El Mencho fits that profile perfectly. A man of imposing physical presence, with a reputation for cruelty confirmed by the visible terror on his enemies' faces when his name is mentioned, with calculated generosity toward his most loyal subordinates. In the most classic sense of the term, he's a capo. El Jardinero is not. El Jardinero is something different. And the question analysts have asked for years is how a man without the violent charisma of traditional criminal leadership could occupy such a central position of power in an organization built on that kind of charisma. The most convincing answer is that El Mencho understood early something many criminal leaders never grasp. that the strategic intelligence he lacked was an asset as valuable as the brute force he possessed, and underestimating it would be a mistake he might not recover from. For his part, El Jardinero understood that his personal security depended on making El Mencho dependent on him in a way that would be hard to replace. And he achieved it not through emotional loyalty, which in the criminal world is always precarious, but through functional indispensability. He became the man without whom the systems didn't work. The man who held the keys to the files, who knew the identities of all the sources, who could read the map of institutional corruption he had built over years. Getting rid of him wouldn't just mean losing a strategist. It would mean losing decades of accumulated intelligence work. That doesn't mean the relationship was free of tension. Sources consulted for this report agree there were significant moments of friction, especially when El Jardinero's strategic decisions clashed with El Mencho's tactical impulses, which often favored immediate violent responses where El Jardinero recommended calculated patience. In at least one documented instance, that tension nearly cost El Jardinero his life. A subordinate's tactical error that El Mencho initially attributed to El Jardinero led to what witnesses describe as the most violent argument they ever had. The crisis resolved when El Jardinero proved, with documentary evidence, that he not only hadn't committed the attributed error, but had warned against the course of action that caused it. Thus, according to some sources, that episode definitively consolidated his position within the organization. Not because El Mencho admired him more, but because El Mencho understood that underestimating him was dangerous for everyone. The CJNG's international reach and El Jardinero's role in building it is one of the least told stories in this saga. The dominant media narrative places the cartel primarily in a Mexican and North American context, emphasizing methamphetamine and fentanyl trafficking into the United States. But that narrative ignores a crucial dimension of what El Jardinero built: the global distribution network that in the second half of the 2000s turned the CJNG into a player present in the drug markets of at least 40 countries. In Europe, CJNG's presence became visible through a series of massive cocaine seizures in Spanish, Dutch, and Italian ports starting in 2017. European investigations that followed those seizures revealed something that surprised even seasoned analysts. Behind those shipments wasn't simply an outsourced distribution network, as had been the historical norm for Mexican cartels in Europe, where they typically sold their product at the Atlantic frontier and left continental distribution to local organizations. What European investigators found was qualitatively different. CJNG's own cells, with their own logistics, communication channels, and money laundering mechanisms, operating semi-autonomously in cities like Madrid, Rotterdam, Valencia, and Naples. In Asia, the story was equally revealing. Through intermediaries in China's precursor chemical markets and organized crime distribution circuits in Australia and Japan, the CJNG had built a methamphetamine supply network operating completely outside traditional drug routes. In Africa, the cartel's logistical networks used ports in weak governance countries as transit points for shipments destined for Europe, turning what had historically been a hemispheric problem into a truly global one. The architect of all that international expansion was, inevitably, El Jardinero. The partially declassified intelligence conversations between the DEA and its European counterparts revealed that American and European analysts reached the same conclusions by different paths. The CJNG's international expansion showed a level of strategic planning and international market knowledge incompatible with the profile of any visible leader in the organization. There had to be someone behind it, someone invisible, who was seeing the global board with a clarity the other players in the organization lacked. That someone was El Jardinero, and by the time intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic reached that conclusion, the man had already been building the next phase of his strategy for years. One of the few documented occasions when El Jardinero's life visibly intersected with the world outside the CJNG came in 2017, when investigators from Mexico's Attorney General's office managed to identify one of his paper identities. The name he was using at the time, which we won't reveal here for security reasons related to witnesses in the case, belonged to a Mexican citizen with an apparently impeccable tax record, registered owner of several companies in the cargo transportation and commercial gardening services sectors. Yes, the nickname and the cover matched with an irony that didn't escape the investigators. Among his shell companies, El Jardinero had a gardening business. The Attorney General's office followed that lead for several months. They established that the companies in question had been used to launder CJNG funds in amounts financial analysts estimated at several hundred million pesos. They also established connections between those companies and legitimate suppliers who didn't know they were being used to clean criminal money. And they began building a case file that, according to sources consulted for this report, was reaching the point where an arrest warrant could have been requested. Then something happened that paralyzed the investigation. There was no accident, no attack, no dramatic event that drew attention. Simply, one October night in 2017, the communications monitoring system investigators had built around the target stopped working. Bank accounts tied to the shell companies were closed. Commercial contracts were terminated. Employees of the companies, real people doing real jobs without necessarily knowing who they worked for, were paid off generously enough to discourage complaints. And the man whose name had begun appearing in the file simply ceased to exist. The paper identity had been burned with the same clinical efficiency El Jardinero had used to build everything else. What remained was silence. And the certainty among investigators who had worked on that file for months that someone inside or very close to the Attorney General's office itself had warned the target that his identity had been compromised. That certainty was as disturbing as the loss of the target itself, because it confirmed what some already suspected but few wanted to say out loud. El Jardinero's intelligence network didn't just watch outward, toward the organization's enemies. It also watched inward, toward the very state institutions supposedly pursuing him. And in that mutual surveillance, in that silent espionage between state and cartel, El Jardinero held an advantage no one in the Mexican government had yet managed to close. The fentanyl trade represents, in the CJNG's history and in El Jardinero's trajectory, a special chapter that deserves its own analysis. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. It was originally developed as a medical anesthetic and is still used for that purpose in hospitals worldwide under strict controls. In the drug trafficking context, however, starting in the mid-2000s, it became the deadliest opioid in history, responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States every year. The CJNG didn't invent fentanyl trafficking. That's important to stress for accuracy. The first illicit fentanyl shipments to reach the US market came through the Sinaloa cartel. But it was the CJNG under El Jardinero's strategic direction that transformed fentanyl trafficking from a marginal operation into an industrial-scale business that eventually rivaled, and on some routes surpassed in profitability, all other drug trafficking businesses combined. The key to that transformation was El Jardinero's early realization, before anyone else in the organization, that fentanyl was fundamentally different from every other narcotic the CJNG had trafficked up to that point. It was synthetic. It didn't depend on agricultural crops that could be eradicated, harvests vulnerable to weather, or biological supply chains that could be interrupted. It depended on chemical precursors that could be legally purchased in China's industrial markets and shipped to Mexico via mail or camouflaged in legitimate industrial shipments. That meant the supply chain was radically shorter, more efficient, and harder to disrupt than those for cocaine or heroin. And it meant enormous profit margins. The raw material investment needed to produce one dose of fentanyl was a fraction of what was needed for an equivalent dose of heroin. El Jardinero spotted that opportunity and built around it a production and distribution chain that included labs installed in industrial properties made to look legitimate, presses for rapid, high-volume pill production, and distribution networks using the same channels built for other narcotics, but with added security protocols. Given the heightened scrutiny, fentanyl was already drawing from US authorities. The result was a fentanyl operation that, according to DEA estimates, at its peak accounted for roughly 30% of illicit fentanyl entering the US market. 150 million doses a year. Thousands of overdose deaths directly attributable to that production. El Jardinero knew. He wasn't just aware of the lethal impact of what he produced and distributed. He had read the reports. He knew the statistics. And he decided to continue anyway. That decision is what makes it harder in any balanced account of his intelligence and strategic ability. To ignore the moral dimension of what he built. Yet because behind every one of those numbers is a person, a devastated family, a life that ended too soon on a bathroom floor, on the street, in a hospital bed. And the architect of that industrial-scale tragedy remained invisible, moving between paper identities, sowing in gardens he would never have to visit. At some point in 2018, according to intelligence sources who contributed to this report, El Jardinero made a decision that surprised even his closest collaborators. He began to delegate. For those who knew him, that decision seemed almost incompatible with his personality. The man who had built his power on total control, who designed systems with the obsession of someone who doesn't trust anyone else to do it right, was now starting to trust others to execute functions he had kept under personal control for years. What had changed? There are several theories. The most convincing, according to consulted analysts, is that the organization's scale had simply outgrown any single individual's ability to oversee it directly. The 2018 CJNG operated in 27 Mexican states in at least 40 countries, with an annual financial flow exceeding the GDP of several Central American countries. No one, no matter how brilliant, could manage all that centrally. Delegation was a functional necessity, but according to some sources, there was also a more personal dimension to the decision. There are indications El Jardinero was facing health issues that, while not immediately disabling, had reminded him with an urgency he'd probably ignored for years that he was mortal, and that if he wanted what he'd built to survive beyond him, he needed to create systems that could function without his direct presence. That was, in a way, the greatest challenge he had ever faced: building systems resilient to the absence of their creator. To that end, he designed what internally became known as the Continuity Protocol, a set of procedures and documentation that allowed his designated successors to understand and operate the structures he had built without his direct involvement. The Continuity Protocol was, in essence, the CJNG Intelligence Operations Manual. It contained decades-built maps of institutional corruption, encrypted communication protocols, money laundering mechanisms, international contacts, risk assessment systems, everything needed for the organization to continue operating with the same strategic efficiency, even if he was no longer available. The mere existence of that protocol is testimony to how deeply El Jardinero had internalized modern corporate management principles. In the legitimate business world, that kind of documentation is called succession planning. In the CJNG world, it was the guarantee his legacy would survive, regardless of what happened to him. But the Continuity Protocol was also a weapon, because whoever controlled it, whoever had access to all that accumulated information, would hold power surpassing any individual in the organization, including El Mencho. And that reality didn't go unnoticed by the cartel's other leaders, creating a new internal power dynamic whose consequences would be felt in the years ahead. By 2019, El Jardinero's name had crossed the threshold of restricted knowledge and begun appearing in official documents from various intelligence agencies in different countries, not with his real name, which remained debated, but with the nickname his collaborators and enemies used to refer to him. That year, the U.S. Department of the Treasury included him on a priority targets list under sanctions against the CJNG under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. The DEA raised his priority level in the rewards program to equivalent to the most wanted targets in recent program history, placing him just below El Mencho himself. Europol, the European Union's police agency, that began including him in its annual briefings on transnational organized crime as one of the actors whose identification and capture would have the greatest potential impact on disrupting Latin American drug trafficking networks in Europe. In intelligence agency jargon, he was a high-value target. But being a high-value target and being captured are two entirely different things. The history of international organized crime is full of high-value targets who remained free for decades. Pablo Escobar took more than a year to locate after escaping La Catedral. Osama bin Laden stayed free for 10 years after 9/11. El Mencho himself has spent more than a decade on most wanted lists without being captured. What made El Jardinero particularly hard to capture wasn't just his personal intelligence or operational discipline, though both contributed significantly. It was the nature of his role within the organization. Unlike El Mencho, who needed regular interaction with subordinates, real-time tactical decisions, and a visible presence that inevitably left traces, El Jardinero could operate almost completely remotely. The architecture he had built, the compartmentalization and delegation systems we've described, allowed him to exert strategic influence over the organization with minimal direct contact that could be detected. The few personal meetings he held were preceded by elaborate counterintelligence operations, last-minute route changes, use of multiple decoy vehicles, meetings in locations selected and communicated only hours before. He was a man who lived as if he permanently knew someone was looking for him. Because he did know, and because that knowledge, far from disturbing him, was as normal a part of his daily routine as morning coffee. The intelligence agencies pursuing him had a term for his mental state: permanent security condition, a state in which the individual has internalized counter-surveillance practices so deeply that they no longer feel like conscious effort, but a natural extension of personality. It's the mindset of the world's best intelligence operatives. And in El Jardinero's case, that state had been cultivated over more than 2 decades, living on the edge of the precipice. The fall of 2019 brought an event that shook Mexico and the entire world with an intensity few could have anticipated. On October 17th of that year, in Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa state and historic heart of the Sinaloa cartel, Mexican federal forces arrested Ovidio Guzman Lopez, son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and presumed heir to the Sinaloa organization's leadership. What followed was an unprecedented spectacle of urban violence in recent Mexican history. The Sinaloa cartel mobilized dozens of armed hitmen within hours, taking over Culiacan's streets, blocking access points, freeing prisoners from a local prison, and threatening indiscriminate massacres if the government didn't release Ovidio. The government backed down. Ovidio was released. The episode, known as the Culiacanazo, created a major political shockwave and laid bare for the world the Mexican state's fragility in the face of the country's most powerful criminal organizations. For El Jardinero, the Culiacanazo was very different from what it was for the rest of Mexico. It was confirmation of something he had long suspected, and a tactical lesson he processed with the analytical coldness that characterized him. What the Culiacanazo demonstrated was that, at the moment of truth, the Mexican state tended to prioritize short-term stability over principled firmness. That the threat of massive violence in a visible urban context could bend a government decision even when circumstances seemed clearly favorable to the state, and that the visibility of violence could, paradoxically, serve as a shield in certain situations. But he also learned what not to do. The Culiacanazo had exposed the Sinaloa cartel to a level of visibility and international scrutiny that would generate consequences for months and years, as it had turned something that usually stayed in intelligence reports into a public debate topic in American and European media. And it had created pressure on the Mexican government that, even if imperfectly applied, would make life harder for all criminal organizations in the country in the following period. The lesson El Jardinero drew was consistent with his general philosophy. The most effective power is the power that doesn't need to prove it exists. The CJNG, in contrast to what the Sinaloa cartel did that day, had to continue its strategy of silent expansion, institutional penetration, and building structures that made spectacular demonstrations of force. Unnecessary, precisely because the force was so real and so deep it didn't need to be shown. That philosophy was strategically correct. But it had a limit. El Jardinero, just in his cold analysis of the Sinaloa episode, may not have seen yet the limit of human nature. The men around him, the operators, hitmen, mid-level commanders, weren't machines of strategic efficiency. They were human beings with fears, ambitions, shifting loyalties. And that human element, always the hardest to control, would eventually begin creating cracks in the system he had built. The COVID-19 pandemic, which reached Mexico in March 2020, transformed the country in ways we still don't fully understand. For the criminal economy, which in some ways operates with market logic similar to the formal economy, The pandemic represented both significant disruption and an adaptation opportunity. Mobility restrictions, border closures, and the paralysis of entire economic sectors created new logistical challenges for criminal organizations. But they also created new opportunities. The exponential increase in online commercial transactions and the accompanying surge in parcel traffic opened new vectors for trafficking narcotics in small quantities, a method customs agencies weren't equipped to control at the necessary scale. As expected, El Jardinero was one of the first to adapt the CJNG strategy to the new circumstances. The pandemic confirmed a trend he had already identified before its arrival. The future of drug trafficking wouldn't lie in large maritime shipments that carried the highest seizure risks, but in distribution through commercial parcel channels that allowed risk to be fractionated across thousands of small shipments, each one, if intercepted, representing minimal loss to the organization. This method, combined with cryptocurrency use for international payments, generated what analysts call the darknet drug trade. Drug trafficking through dark web e-commerce platforms that, in theory, allows sellers and buyers to operate with anonymity that law enforcement agencies increasingly struggle to penetrate. The CJNG hadn't developed this model on its own. In the dark web market, Latin American origin sellers had historically been a minority compared to Europeans and North Americans. But El Jardinero saw in that market not so much an opportunity for direct-to-consumer sales, which would have involved too small an operational scale for his goals, but a logistical model that could be applied at wholesale scale. During that period, he built a distribution network using the same technological channels and anonymization technique as dark web retail operators, but applied to volumes 100 or 1,000 times larger than ordinary online criminal commerce flows. The result was a new CJNG business line that intelligence agencies, still oriented toward traditional trafficking models, took months to begin detecting. And by the time they did detect it, the systems had matured enough to be once again extremely resistant to disruption. The pandemic also had an effect El Jardinero hadn't fully anticipated. It accelerated the replacement of physical presence with virtual presence in the organization's management structures. Mobility restrictions pushed many previously in-person meetings with all their tracking risks to encrypted communication platforms. Paradoxically, that made the organization, at least in its leadership structures, temporarily harder to track. But it also created new digital vulnerabilities that over time would be exploited in ways no perfectly designed security system could fully prevent. The years 2020 and 2021 saw an escalation in violence between the CJNG and its main rivals that shook entire regions of Mexico with renewed brutality. The war with the United Cartels, an alliance of smaller organizations that had tried to halt the CJNG's expansion in Michoacán, Guerrero, and the Bajío, reached levels of violence during those years that chillingly redefined any conventional notion of internal armed conflict. Entire municipalities were contested block by block, highways blocked for days, massacres leaving dozens of bodies abandoned in graves or displayed on bridges as terror messages to local communities and rival organizations. El Jardinero's role in that war was, as always, that of the invisible strategist. He didn't design individual massacres. He didn't give direct orders to kill, but he designed the campaign's overall logic. Which territories to prioritize, which temporary alliances with secondary actors were convenient, how to manage resource flows to active fronts, how to handle the media and government pressure generated by the violence without that pressure translating into operations that affected the organization's central structure. To use an analogy he himself would have recognized from his university training, he was the operations manager of a war, not the general ordering the attack, but the logistics director, ensuring resources were in the right place at the right time and that the campaign's costs remained sustainable for the organization in the long term. But that war was also generating something El Jardinero had tried to avoid throughout his career: visibility. The scale of violence in Michoacán and the Bajío was so large, so systematic, so clearly the product of centralized planning that questions about who was behind the CJNG's strategy began appearing with troubling frequency in specialized media and international intelligence reports. El Jardinero's name began to be spoken publicly for the first time, not with his real identity, which remained unknown, but with his nickname, with descriptions of his functions, and with something even more dangerous from his perspective, descriptions, albeit incomplete, of some of the principles guiding his methodology. That partial visibility was a reminder that no security system, no matter how perfect in design, can indefinitely compensate for the accumulation of evidence generated by the prolonged existence of an actor at that scale. El Jardinero knew it, and according to sources close to the Attorney General's office, investigations, during that period, it led him to begin considering something he had previously deemed unnecessary: an exit plan. The concept of an exit plan, in the context of high-level drug trafficking, is far more complex and less common than Hollywood scripts suggest. Leaving isn't just changing your name and moving to another country. For someone in El Jardinero's position, with the level of information about the organization he possessed and the conflicts of interest that information created, leaving was an extremely delicate problem, requiring years of advanced planning. The fundamental problem is this: a man who knows so much cannot simply stop knowing. The information El Jardinero had accumulated over 2 decades as the CJNG's chief strategist was simultaneously his most valuable asset and his greatest source of vulnerability. While he remained active inside the organization, that information made him indispensable and therefore protected him. But if he tried to withdraw, that same information would make him the most dangerous potential witness the CJNG had ever faced. And the organization had well-established procedures for handling dangerous potential witnesses. So any concrete exit plan, if one existed, couldn't be a simple retirement. It had to be something more sophisticated. Some sources consulted for this report suggest that in 2020 and 2021, El Jardinero began exploring the possibility of negotiating, absolutely secretly, through maximum trust intermediaries, some kind of deal with a foreign intelligence agency that would guarantee him protection in exchange for information. Not conventional judicial cooperation, which would have involved too much exposure, but something closer to the deals intelligence agencies from both Cold War blocs made with enemy intelligence actors: protection, resources, and a new identity in exchange for access to high-value strategic information. According to those same sources, the DEA and CIA were aware of those approaches and explored them seriously. But the problem was always the same: verifying that the information El Jardinero offered as a sample was genuine without compromising the rest of the operation, and managing the enormous political and judicial risk that would come for the US government from being perceived as having negotiated impunity for one of the most wanted criminals in the Western world. If those negotiations reached any concrete point, that remains classified information. What can be said, based on publicly documented facts, is that El Jardinero was never captured, never extradited, never appeared before any court, and in a career spanning more than 2 decades at the center of one of the world's most hunted criminal organizations, that isn't mere good luck. It's evidence of something more, of a functioning protection system, of a level of planning that continues operating even when the world believes the man is gone. Or perhaps of a deal whose terms the world will never know. Any honest analysis of El Jardinero's story must address a topic that may be uncomfortable, because ignoring it would be a form of complicity with a narrative that softens what actually happened. That topic is the human cost. During the years, El Jardinero operated as the CJNG's chief strategist. The cartel was directly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in Mexico. Murders of police, military personnel, rival organization members, but also with devastating frequency, civilians. Civilians who got in the organization's way. Civilians who refused to collaborate or surrender their property. Civilians who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And outside Mexico, tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States and Europe, directly attributable to fentanyl and other substances El Jardinero helped produce and distribute. It's a number hard to calculate precisely, but the most conservative estimates from epidemiologists specializing in the opioid crisis suggest the CJNG is directly responsible for more than 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States between 2016 and 2023. 100,000 lives. 100,000 individual stories of people with families, plans, loves, hopes, reduced to statistics by a criminal supply chain El Jardinero, designed with the same corporate efficiency an industrial engineer uses to design a production line. This dimension of the story has no possible justification. Not the exceptional intelligence of El Jardinero. Not the fascination his methodology generates in analysts. Not the comparisons some make between his strategic skills and those admired in business or military figures. Intelligence in the service of mass destruction deserves no admiration. At best, it deserves a clinical analysis that allows us to understand what produced that destruction and how it could have been prevented. At worst, it deserves the judgment no court has yet been able to deliver. And this report, which has tried to tell El Jardinero's story with the greatest possible precision and complexity, cannot and will not end without stating that uncomfortable truth. Brilliance without conscience is, ultimately, brilliance in the service of the abyss. And the abyss El Jardinero helped build continues claiming victims today, as these words are read. The human cost of his story is not a secondary detail. It may be the only detail that truly matters. The CJNG's recruitment story under El Jardinero's strategic direction is another chapter deserving detailed analysis, because it reveals something about the organization's nature that goes beyond the conventional media image of a violent criminal gang. CJNG recruitment, during its years of greatest expansion, was a sophisticated, multidimensional process operating simultaneously at various levels of Mexican society. At the most basic level, the organization recruited the way all cartels do, offering quick money to young people with no options in communities devastated by poverty and institutional abandonment. But El Jardinero added an extra layer to the traditional recruitment model that made it qualitatively more efficient: specialized recruitment. Alongside hitmen and field operators, the CJNG needed communications engineers to maintain its encrypted systems, accountants and lawyers to manage its financial infrastructure, logistics experts to administer international supply chains, intelligence analysts to process information from its source network. In other words, it needed professionals, and it recruited them the way a multinational corporation recruits talent, with salaries far exceeding what any legitimate employer could offer, guarantees of family security, and the clear understanding that the alternative to accepting the offer could be considerably less pleasant. Some of those professionals arrived in the organization without fully knowing who they were working for. A systems engineer hired by what turned out to be a CJNG front company could spend months or years without understanding the real nature of his employer, convinced he was working for a private tech firm with unusual security practices. When he eventually understood the reality, the logic of sunk costs kicked in. He had earned too much, knew too much, was too compromised to back out without devastating consequences. That cycle of involuntary recruitment was particularly successful in the university sector, where El Jardinero had ordered the construction of a talent capture network operating through mentors and authority figures inside academic institutions who, without necessarily being active organization members, channeled the brightest students in the most relevant disciplines toward it. It was a recruitment mechanism security analysts describe as particularly pernicious because it compromised individuals with legitimate training before they could fully grasp the consequences of what they were doing. And it generated for the organization a constant flow of high-level intellectual capital that no open recruitment process could have produced. In sum, El Jardinero applied the principles of corporate headhunting to the consolidation of a criminal organization. And those principles, in his hands, he proved just as effective in that context as they were in the context for which they were designed. The year 2022 marked a turning point in the pressure U.S. intelligence agencies were exerting on the CJNG. The Biden administration, pressed by the devastating impact of the fentanyl crisis in the United States, where overdose deaths surpassed 100,000 for the first time in the country's history in 2021, raised the level of covert operations against the cartel's top leaders. The CJNG was redesignated as a foreign terrorist organization by some agencies, though that specific status never formalized in U.S. legislation due to diplomatic complications it would have created with Mexico. But operationally, the level of resources and attention devoted to dismantling the organization reached unprecedented levels in the history of Mexican drug trafficking persecution. For El Jardinero, that increased pressure meant the margins for error he had previously allowed, always small, now became practically non-existent. Every communication was potentially a trap. Every meeting, a risk. Every collaborator, a vector for infiltration. It was in that context of maximum pressure that, according to consulted intelligence sources, the closest thing to a capture El Jardinero had experienced since his beginnings occurred. Precise details of that episode remain largely classified, but the general contours, leaked by sources with access to the information, are as follows. Sometime in the second half of 2022, a trusted collaborator of El Jardinero someone who had worked with him for years and had access to information about his routines and communication mechanisms, reached a cooperation agreement with US authorities. The operation designed on the basis of that cooperation was the most elaborate the DEA had ever built regarding the CJNG. It involved more than 100 agents in 2 countries. It entailed constructing an electronic and physical surveillance network that for weeks produced no results because El Jardinero somehow had moved. When the operation finally reached the point that should have located the target, what agents found was evidence that someone had been there very recently, but was already gone. The track from the episode that opens this story, the one that disappeared on the road to Chapala in October 2019, was only one in a sequence of failed approaches. There had been others, and there would be more afterward. The question tormenting investigators wasn't whether El Jardinero was locatable. It was whether they had such a deep leak in their own organization that the answer to that question might never be affirmative. In the social fabric of the communities where the CJNG operated during its years of greatest power, El Jardinero's presence left marks that are hard to see from the outside, but that residents of those communities recognize in their daily lives. They aren't the marks of a capo distributing money among the poor with the theatrical generosity some narcos use to build popular loyalty. As far as is known, El Jardinero had no such vocation for criminal populism, the kind that characterized figures like Pablo Escobar or some Sinaloa bosses. His traces in the community fabric are of another kind. They are traces of institutionalized fear, of disappearances, of people who opposed the organization or simply knew too much, of the silent colonization of local government structures that turned mayors and public security directors into managers of the cartel's interests without most citizens knowing. They are traces of an informal economy kept running only because it paid protection money to the organization, of young people who vanished from their communities only to reappear months later as cartel operators, irreversibly transformed. And they are also, perhaps most disturbingly, traces of normalization. Yet the extent to which the CJNG's presence became normalized in some communities in Jalisco, Michoacán, and the Bajío during those years is one of the most worrying phenomena of contemporary organized crime in Mexico. Not because communities supported the cartel, that claim is false and slanderous in most cases, but because the state had abandoned those territories so completely, for so long, that the criminal organization had become the only available provider of services, order, and certainty for those who lived there. El Jardinero understood that phenomenon. He had studied it, and he had deliberately instrumentalized it as part of his territorial consolidation strategy, providing certain basic community security services, resolving certain local conflicts, degenerating in the population the perception that the organization, at least for those who didn't challenge it, was a predictable actor and, on its own terms, relatively reasonable, was part of the governance strategy for the territories it controlled. In academic terms, it was what political scientists call criminal governance, the provision of governmental functions by non-state actors in the absence of the state. And it was a trap those communities found increasingly hard to escape, because escaping required a state that returned to fulfill its functions. And in many of those places, that state still hasn't returned. The debt Mexico owes its own victims of organized crime is a debt rarely named in appropriate terms. The grand narratives about Mexican drug trafficking speak of spectacular seizures, media-friendly arrests, Yeah, so she, yeah, so does. Cartel wars narrated with action thriller aesthetics. They speak little of the mothers searching for their disappeared children in mass graves scattered across the country. Little of journalists murdered for reporting on organized crime, turning Mexico into one of the world's most dangerous countries for practicing journalism. Little of human rights defenders disappeared for trying to document abuses. Little of the thousands of farmers and small merchants who lost their properties, businesses, entire communities to the CJNG's territorial expansion. All that massive human devastation is as much a part of El Jardinero's story as his intelligence systems and financial models. Because it was on that suffering that his systems were built. It was using that devastation as an instrument that his power was consolidated. And it is in that reality that the narration of his story must find its moral anchor, no matter how uncomfortable that is for those who prefer history as an exercise in intellectual fascination. The numbers are unbearable when faced head-on. More than 300,000 people murdered in Mexico since the so-called war on drugs began. More than 100,000 disappeared, many of them in CJNG-controlled territories. Tens of thousands of internally displaced people who abandoned their communities fleeing violence. A generation of young people in some regions who grew up without any real option for a future different from the one offered by the only organization that seemed to provide certainty in a world of total uncertainty. That is El Jardinero's real legacy. Not the elegance of his intelligence systems, not the sophistication of his financial architecture, not the tactical precision of his operations. The real legacy is that enormous void where lives that never got to be should have been. The real legacy is mothers marching through city streets that refuse to look at them, laminated photos hanging around their necks. The real legacy is disappearance case files stacked in institutions lacking the resources, or, in too many cases, the will to resolve them. The real legacy is Mexico with its wounds open. And that legacy, no strategic brilliance can redeem it. No intellectual capacity can justify it. It can only be named, without euphemisms, for what it is. As of March 2026, when this report is being prepared, the current status of the El Jardinero case is as follows. The man remains unidentified publicly by his real name, yet he remains uncaptured. He continues to be actively sought by the DEA, Mexico's Attorney General's Office, Europol, and various other intelligence agencies. His code name appears on the world's most wanted lists. His physical description, vague and potentially outdated, circulates in the intelligence systems of 24 countries. His head carries a price that, combining rewards offered by the US and Mexican governments, exceeds $15 million. Yet, like a university-educated ghost with an unknown address, El Jardinero remains free. At least 3 hypotheses circulate in intelligence circles to explain that persistent impunity. The first is the simplest and least satisfying. That he is simply very good at what he does, and his operational security system is so superior to the tracking capabilities of the agencies pursuing him that they still haven't located him. This hypothesis is supported by documented facts, but it's hard to sustain absolutely given the level of resources US agencies, in particular, have devoted to his pursuit for years. The second hypothesis is that there is a leak, or multiple leaks, in one or more of the security apparatuses pursuing him. Leaks providing him advance information about operations against him sufficient for him to evade them. This hypothesis also has support in some documented episodes, including the one from 2017 described earlier. And it is the most disturbing of the three, because it implies the problem isn't just El Jardinero's capability, but the systemic corruption surrounding him. But the third hypothesis is the most speculative, but, for some analysts, the most consistent with the totality of facts. That at some point in one of the multiple approaches described in this report, an agreement was reached. A secret agreement, not recorded in any judicial file, trading impunity for information. The kind of agreement the world's most powerful intelligence services have made throughout history, with actors who knew too much to simply be eliminated or imprisoned. If that third hypothesis is correct, then El Jardinero would today be living under a new identity. In some place his institutional benefactors have carefully kept undisclosed, periodically providing information only he can provide about the CJNG structures and the global criminal network he helped build. And the scandal wouldn't be his freedom. The scandal would be what that freedom reveals about the true nature of the war on drugs. In 2026, the CJNG remains Mexico's most powerful criminal organization. El Mencho remains its nominal leader, but intelligence sources consulted for this report agree the organization has undergone, since approximately 2022, an internal fragmentation process that has reduced the strategic coherence that characterized it during its years of greatest expansion. Several of the cadres El Jardinero trained and to whom he delegated strategic functions have been captured, killed or split off to form their own structures in the territories they controlled. The architecture he designed to be resilient remains resistant to total dismantling. But without the central brain that kept it cohesive, it has begun showing the fractures that inevitably accompany any human system that loses its main architect. What remains is a powerful organization, but less elegant, more brutal and less calculated, more reactive and less strategic. A cartel still capable of devastating violence, but that has lost, at least temporarily, the ability to turn that violence into orderly territorial expansion and deep institutional consolidation. That is no consolation for the communities still suffering its presence. The fragmented CJNG remains more lethal than most of its rivals. But it is a relevant fact for any analysis of El Jardinero's strategic legacy, yet because it retroactively confirms something he always knew. The difference between a durable criminal organization and one that implodes in internal violence isn't the number of rifles, but the quality of thought directing them. The CJNG without El Jardinero is like a company without its chief strategy officer. It can keep functioning for years, keep generating revenue, keep being big. But it has lost the long-term vision that made it truly dangerous. And that, though not enough to dismantle it, is at least a crack through which light might eventually enter. Fundamental questions remain that this report, with all available information and all the rigor we could apply to its construction, cannot answer. Who is El Jardinero really? What is his true name? The one on the birth certificate, a quiet boy from some southern Jalisco town received nearly 50 years ago. Is he alive? Where is he? Is he still active inside the organization he built? Has he reached some deal with a government agency guaranteeing his impunity? We don't know the answer to any of those questions with the certainty needed to affirm them. And that ignorance, that persistent shadow zone around one of the most influential contemporary organized crime actors, is itself a kind of answer. It tells us that the intelligence systems of the world's most powerful countries have limits, and intelligent and patient enough man can exploit for decades. It tells us institutional corruption in Mexico remains deep and systemic enough to protect actors who should have been located and brought to justice years ago. But it tells us the rule of law, that concept every government speech invokes as often as facts disprove it, remains an unfulfilled promise for millions of Mexicans and thousands of CJNG victims. And it tells us something else, perhaps the most uncomfortable of all: the collective fascination with figures like El Jardinero, that mix of horror and admiration with which the world looks at those who build power outside the law with a competence many legitimate institutions would envy, is itself part of the problem. Because when that fascination turns into aestheticization, when it transforms the organized crime narrative into entertainment without moral anchor, it helps normalize what should be absolutely intolerable. There is no glamour in clandestine graves, no elegance in fentanyl overdoses, no sophistication in the fear that paralyzes entire communities. There is only the suffering of real people that a system built with exceptional intelligence and no conscience whatsoever stole from them. Something no reward can ever return. And yet here we are, telling this story. Because ignoring El Jardinero's existence, pretending his story doesn't matter or is too dark to explore, would also be a betrayal of the victims. Victims deserve us to understand what happened to them, to comprehend the mechanisms that generated their suffering, to be able to name those responsible with enough precision that the future can learn from the past. That is what investigative journalism tries to do when it works well. Not to celebrate the villain, but to illuminate the system that produced him and sustained him. El Jardinero is not an isolated phenomenon. He is the product of decades of institutional abandonment, structural poverty, systemic corruption, and international drug markets that continue generating the economic incentives, making drug trafficking the most profitable industry available to those without access to legitimate structures of success. Those conditions weren't created by him. They were exploited by him. And as long as those conditions persist, as long as the Mexican state remains so fragile in its basic institutions, as long as demand for drugs in developed world markets continues generating the profits, sustaining organizations like the CJNG, others will keep appearing. Perhaps not with El Jardinero's exceptional intelligence, perhaps without the same operational elegance, but with the same willingness to build power on the suffering of others in the same abandoned territories, with the same communities trapped between the absence of the state and the omnipresence of crime. The true story of El Jardinero, in the end, doesn't end with him. It ends, or rather doesn't end, with the country and the world that made him possible. And it continues being written today, in the streets of Jalisco and Michoacán, in the ports of Rotterdam and Valencia, in the precursor chemical labs of Guangzhou, at the negotiating tables where governments debate drug policies that always seem to arrive too late to the problems they try to solve. The seed El Jardinero planted more than 2 decades ago is still growing, and the garden he built, the dark, utterly invisible garden he cultivated with so much patience and so little scruple, continues bearing its bitter fruit in places we prefer not to look directly until we can no longer avoid it.